This case takes place in the Republic of Ireland on the 12th of January 2020. Drogheda is a port town in the Republic of Ireland. Cian Mulready Woods was born there on the 2nd of February 2003. Growing up, his favourite thing to do was to take his motocross bike out for a spin over some jumps and down dirt tracks. But in his early teenage years, he began involving himself in some petty crime, and in around 2018, he turned towards organised crime when he was just 15, and garnered a reputation as a rather violent individual. The 12th of January 2020 started out like any other for the Mulready Woods family, but by the time Sunday afternoon had rolled around, everything had changed. Cian was missing, and not a single person could get a hold of him. On the Monday afternoon, his sister posted on Facebook, asking if anyone knew where her brother was. The last time Cian had been seen was on the Sunday evening near his home. Earlier that day, Cian had called his mother to ask her to leave him some money to pay for a taxi home. Since then, none of his family or friends had been able to get a hold of him. He was last seen wearing a navy blue Hugo Boss tracksuit, black Hugo Boss runners, along with a Canada Goose jacket and a Gucci baseball cap. Eventually, his family reported him missing to the Garda, which is the name for the National Police Service in the Republic of Ireland. When the officers took a closer look at Cian's history, they realised his family had a good reason to be worried. Just days before Cian disappeared, a video had been posted on social media by a local criminal, and in this video the man made repeated threats to kill the 17-year-old. The threats were explicit and involved the words abduction, murder, and dismemberment. At the time, Drogheda was in the midst of a deadly gang feud, and by the time Cian reached his teenage years, this feud had escalated into full-blown war, and he was a part of the gangs. The violence meant that parts of the city were labelled as dangerous no-go zones, which most people tried to avoid. The dark underworld promised money, designer clothes, and prestige, and it didn't take long before Cian was in deep. He became involved in one of the major dealing gangs right at the time when its rivalry with a competing gang was starting to heat up. This was not the type of gang war where the violence was limited to threats and demonstrations of superiority. This was much more brutal than that. Cian's group carried weapons, and they weren't afraid to use them. They also had a knack for building pipe bombs and petrol bombs, which they used to attack their opponents' hideouts. Before long, Cian was playing a first-hand role in the violence. In 2019, he smashed a window and threw a petrol bomb inside the home of a boy who owed the gang money. Cian told them he would burn them alive in their beds, and he claimed he didn't do it properly last time. Not long after this incident, he was arrested and charged with possession of illegal substances. There are also reports that Cian tortured and killed a woman's cat because this woman owed him money and she couldn't pay it back in time. This is but a few of the things that Cian had been accused of, and what gave him the reputation of an extremely violent young man. By the time of his disappearance, Cian was already very well known by the police, but some of this troubling information came to light after Cian was reported missing. But by the time the officers had pieced together his movements over the last few months leading up to his disappearance, it was already too late. On the Monday, just a couple of hours after Cian's sister posted asking for help to find him, a man walking down the street in East Dublin came across a bulky sports bag. When he opened the zipper, he was met with a horrifying sight: multiple dismembered human limbs, and strangely, a pair of flip-flops. The following morning at 1:30 a.m, officers responded to reports of a burning vehicle. When the firefighters extinguished the blaze, they found a human head and 2 hands entangled in the burnt-out wreck. DNA tests then proved that the head and limbs all belonged to Cian. The flip-flops did not belong to him, but in the wake of his murder, they were interpreted as an additional threat to the gang he was known to run with. It turns out that weeks before Cian's murder, a 35-year-old man from the opposing gang was attacked on the street. He was leaving a gym at the time and was wearing a pair of flip-flops which was stolen during the attack.
Yeah! That's only the start of it! That's only the start of it! That's only the start of it, Robbie!
Someone from Keane's gang then posed for a photo with the sandals and posted the image on social media with a caption mocking the guy they belonged to. The man who owned these flip-flops was Robbie Lawler. The murder and dismemberment of a teenager might seem like an overly dramatic retaliation for the loss of a pair of sandals, but for those who knew Robbie Lawler's reputation, it was exactly his style. Robbie was a hitman and was a member of a gang known as the Anti-Maguire faction. He became the prime suspect in the murder of Keane. He was also the chief suspect for a string of other killings, including that of criminal Mark Bryan in 2005, David Fred Lynch in 2009, his friend Noel Deans in 2010, and his former best friend Kenneth Finn in 2018. He had a vicious reputation on the streets, and even those on his side knew not to cross him. I've seen reports from people who were in prison with him who spoke about the fear he instilled in the other inmates. Sadly, despite his violent record, he was released from prison just 1 month before Keane's murder. Robbie was then definitively tied to Keane's death when one of his associates pointed investigators in the direction of the house where the teenager had been murdered. Gerard McKenna was the owner of the home, and he told the police that Robbie had threatened to kill him and his children and turn them into minced meat if he did not clean up the crime scene mess inside his home properly. But when he arrived home after the killing of Keane, there was far too much blood, and he had been unable to get rid of all of the evidence. After Keane's partial remains were found, the Garda released a statement saying that what happened to Keane was a brutal and savage attack. Keane's family were of course devastated by his death, and the way in which his body had been so gruesomely discarded and mutilated. All they had was his head, his hands, and his limbs, and there was hope that the rest of his remains would be found so they could lay him to rest intact. 3 months later, in April of 2020, the final pieces of Keane's dismembered body were found in his hometown. The remains were discovered hidden in overgrown bushes in a ravine. It is believed that Robbie's associates were told to deliver his torso to the home of his biggest rival, but when the bag containing Keane's limbs was found so quickly, they dumped what was left instead. In the months that had passed, a large amount of Keane's torso had been eaten by animals. The media then reported that Keane was officially warned by the police that his life was in danger on the 5th of January 2020, and was suspected of playing both sides of the feuding gangs, a suspicion that would ultimately be one of the reasons he was targeted for murder. Keane wore a ballistic vest because of the threats to his life. News then came to light on how Keane died when 2 men were arrested. Rival gang members Paul Crosby, aged 27, and Gerard Cruz, aged 49. It turned out that on the day that Keane went missing, Paul Crosby met with him. Keane likely trusted Paul due to him playing both sides of the gangs. They met outside a shop in the town, and Keane got into the car with him and Gerard, before being driven to the house where he would be murdered. Keane was tortured with power tools by the killer, and stabbed multiple times to the torso. It is believed that the gruesome torture and murder was recorded and filmed, intended to be used to send a message to the rival gang. It is believed that the footage of the appalling crime is out there somewhere, but as far as I can tell, it has not been confirmed by the police. Keane's body was then dismembered using the power tools. There was no evidence that Paul Crosby and Gerard Cruz were present at the time of the murder, but they were the ones who lured him to his death. Despite Robbie being a key suspect in Keane's murder from the get-go, he was never arrested, nor was he charged. The opportunity for justice was missed completely when Robbie was killed in a gangland shooting not long after Keane's torso was discovered. Paul Crosby and Gerard Cruz were charged in relation to the murder of Keane. Paul was given a 10-year sentence, whilst Gerard was given 7 years. The 2 men pleaded guilty to facilitating the murder. The 2 men could be seen laughing as they were brought to the holding cell, with one even being overheard bragging, "We got off lightly." Gerard McKenna, the man who owned the property in which Keane was killed in, received a 4-year sentence for his role in attempting to destroy evidence of a crime. There doesn't seem to be a great deal of information about the extent of how Keane was tortured. However, I did see some reports about a drill being used. The case prompted one of Ireland's leading politicians to say that it is probably one of the most gruesome and grotesque murders they could think of, and the police described Keane's death as one of the worst murders they had ever seen, which is disturbing to think about, as these officers have likely dealt with many gang killings. There are also some rumours floating around about his death that night. Some have claimed that Keane managed to get out of the house during the torture and ran to nearby houses, knocking on their doors and begging for help. But nobody offered any help due to his reputation as a firebomber, and he was eventually dragged back inside and killed. But as I said, these are just rumours from people who live in the area. Keane's murder is a stark reminder of the devastating consequences of gang violence and how young, impressionable people get caught up in a life of crime.